Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to connect the dots between an explosive crypto short squeeze, a global bond market rescue, and the insatiable power demands of AI data centers. Now, I know at first glance these sound like completely separate corners of the financial universe. But as we unpack the source material today, you're going to see how they are all actually deeply intertwined. Let's get into it.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. 1. The historic crypto squeeze. 2. The global bond warning. 3. Nuclear power for AI. And 4. Catalysts, Nvidia and Jackson. Kicking things off with Section 1, the historic crypto squeeze, a political push and a massive market reaction. We got to start with this staggering number. Bitcoin just surged 22% in only 5 days. That's its absolute best 5-day performance since March 2024. And as we know in these markets, a move of that magnitude doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It forces a massive reaction. The sheer scale of that reaction is what's truly mind-blowing here. That 22% surge wiped out $4 billion in short positions. Let that sink in. This cascade of liquidations officially became the second largest short squeeze in the entire history of the crypto markets. When shorts get squeezed at this scale, forced buying just piles on more momentum, creating an absolute rocket ship effect. But what actually lit the fuse? Well, it was triggered by a major political event. Back on August 20th, a White House meeting took place where President Trump hosted the CEOs of Coinbase, Robinhood, and Kraken. During this meeting, he directly urged Congress to pass a fair version of the Clarity Act, essentially setting a hard deadline for the September 14 Senate return. Looking at this purely from a neutral market mechanics standpoint, this direct intervention was a massive catalyst. It signaled clear regulatory momentum to institutional investors, completely flipped market sentiment, and ultimately pushed Bitcoin past that $77,800 mark. The institutional response was immediate. Jeffrey Kendrick over at Standard Chartered pointed out that the underlying mechanics in the broader market were setting up perfectly for this rally. He called it exactly the type of thing Bitcoin loves. Standard Chartered actually raised their year-end Bitcoin target to $100,000 right after this. But to truly grasp what Kendrick meant by those underlying mechanics, we have to step outside of crypto entirely. Which brings us to Section 2, the global bond warning. Let's look at the hidden levers of the market. To understand what was fueling that momentum, we have to pull back the curtain and look at the sheer severity of what was happening in global bonds at that exact same moment. The U.S. 30-year Treasury had hit a 19-year high. But this wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon. Long-term sovereign debt was selling off globally. Japan's 10-year bond hit a 30-year high. Germany and France hit highs we haven't seen in over a decade. We were looking at a synchronized global bond sell-off, which is exactly the kind of underlying structural stress that usually precedes massive market volatility. So why were global bonds suddenly under so much pressure? It really comes down to this concept, the hyperscaler crowding out theory. The big tech giants, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, they have collectively committed to over $200 billion in AI capital expenditures for 2026. And they have to borrow to build all this infrastructure. So suddenly, you have these massive tech hyperscalers competing head-to-head with governments for the exact same pool of global investor capital. When both sides are issuing hundreds of billions in debt, yields get pushed higher across the board, which, by the way, ultimately dictates the interest rates you and I pay on everything from mortgages to auto loans. Obviously, something had to give. The U.S. Treasury was forced to intervene. They announced an expansion of bond buybacks in 20- and 30-year bonds just to pull those yields off their extreme 19-year highs. This technical liquidity operation essentially rescued the market. And here's where the convergence happens. By injecting that liquidity to calm the bond market, the Treasury inadvertently provided the exact macroeconomic rocket fuel that, when combined with the Clarity Act news, ignited that historic $4 billion crypto short squeeze. Let's move on to Section 3, nuclear power for AI, the infrastructure colliding with sovereign debt. So if AI infrastructure spending is putting this much pressure on global bond markets, we really need to zoom in on exactly what they're building out there. The biggest bottleneck for AI isn't just microchips anymore, it's raw power. Which begs the question, why are these hyperscalers pivoting so aggressively toward nuclear energy? The answer lies in the intense physical requirements of AI. These data centers need continuous, uninterrupted, 24/7 base load power to train their massive models. Wind and solar are great, sure, but they lack constant uptime. The wind doesn't always blow, and the sun sets. At the same time, these hyperscalers have made very public commitments to hit 100% carbon-free power by 2030. Add in the fact that these data center campuses are totally land-constrained and need incredibly high thermal density, and nuclear power suddenly becomes the only viable scientific solution that checks every single box. So how does this actually build into an investment thesis? Take a company called X Energy, which is developing melt-proof small modular reactors. We are looking at an incredibly polarized setup here. The bull case is phenomenal. They have a massive anchor client in Amazon who just committed to 5 gigawatts of capacity. They're partnered with Nvidia and AWS on AI-assisted nuclear engineering, and they actually have an NRC commercial fuel fabrication license in hand right now. Analysts even have a price target implying a 130% upside from their roughly $19 share price. But look at the bear case. This is still a pre-revenue company. They are currently reliant on $54.6 million in grant income, they have an accelerating cash burn, and they are completely at the mercy of notoriously unpredictable nuclear regulatory timelines. It perfectly encapsulates the high-risk, high-reward reality of this AI infrastructure boom. Finally, Section 4, Catalysts, Nvidia and Jackson, the events that set September.
Now that we see how the AI build-out is directly tied to both the global bond market and the energy sector, let's look at the ticking clock of upcoming market catalysts. We are heading into an incredibly consequential few days that will completely define the financial narrative for September. Wednesday brings Nvidia earnings, Thursday kicks off Jackson Hole, and Friday gives us a massive keynote address from Fed Chair Warsh.
First up on that timeline is Nvidia. The market isn't just looking at the past here, it's obsessing over the future. The consensus for Q2 is around $91.85 billion. But what investors are specifically zeroing in on is that Q3 guidance. They want to see a target above $95 billion. They need to see that number to prove that this massive AI infrastructure cycle, the very one stressing global bond markets and pushing for nuclear reactor rollouts, is still accelerating, not plateauing.
And then, assuming we make it past Nvidia, all eyes turn to Friday. Fed Chair Warsh steps up to the podium at Jackson Hole. But pay close attention to the highly anticipated theme of his keynote speech, financial innovation and policy. This is the first Jackson Hole in history to center specifically on digital payments and fintech. And he'll be speaking right on the heels of that 22% Bitcoin surge and the massive legislative momentum for the Clarity Act. Which leaves us with this final, massive question to consider today. Knowing that AI borrowing is heavily stressing bond yields, while crypto legislation is making history at the White House, we have to ask, what happens when all these forces finally collide this week? If Nvidia validates the AI cycle and the Fed openly addresses digital assets, are we witnessing the exact tipping point where tech infrastructure, crypto regulation, and traditional monetary policy permanently fuse together? It's a fascinating convergence, and it completely changes the way we have to look at these markets going forward. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on the data this week.